Montana Territory, December 1883. A canvas corridor stretches between a log cabin and a weather barn. 40 feet of stitched tent fabric, lashed to wooden frames, flapping softly in the bitter wind. To anyone riding past the Hartwell homestead that winter, it looked like desperation wearing burlap. But inside that makeshift tunnel, something remarkable was happening. While her neighbors burned through cords of wood and shivered through barn runs that left cabins freezing for hours, Sarah Hartwell walked to her livestock in relative comfort. No ice forming on her shawl. No brutal wind stealing the heat from her home. No children huddled by a dying fire, waiting for mother to return from feeding the animals. The question that winter wasn't whether her idea looked strange. The question was, what did this widowed homesteader understand about heat loss that experienced builders had missed? Before we go further, if you're interested in real frontier solutions that actually worked when survival depended on it, hit that subscribe button. Every week, I bring you techniques that kept people alive in conditions that would break modern systems. And drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. I want to know how many of you are facing real winters right now. Sarah Hartwell wasn't supposed to be running a homestead alone. In the fall of 1882, her husband Jacob had been dragged by a spooked horse while clearing timber near the north property line. The local doctor did what he could, but infection took him within a week. She was 31 years old, with 2 children, Emma, age 9, and Daniel, barely 6, and 40 acres of Montana grassland that turned into frozen hell 4 months out of every year. The Hartwell cabin sat 80 feet from the barn. During summer, it was a pleasant walk. During winter, it became a daily gauntlet. Every morning before dawn, Sarah made the trip to milk the 2 cows and feed the chickens. Every evening after sunset, she went again to check the animals and secure them for the night. 20 minutes outside in January cold. 20 minutes of wind that cut through wool like it was paper. 20 minutes that, according to her careful observations, dropped the cabin's internal temperature by 15 degrees. 15 degrees. That meant when she left at 6 a.m. with the cabin at 68 degrees Fahrenheit, she returned to find it at 53 degrees Fahrenheit. The fire had been banked, but the door openings twice because she had to go in and come back out. Let the cold pour in like water through a broken dam. The children woke shivering. The water bucket had ice forming at the edges, and she had to burn extra wood just to get the temperature back up, only to repeat the entire process 12 hours later. Her neighbors faced the same problem. Most of them just accepted it. That's winter, they said. That's the cost of keeping stock. But Sarah had been trained as a seamstress before heading west. She understood fabric. She understood how canvas held against wind. She understood that the Crow people, whose abandoned campsites she'd seen in the valley, moved through winter with portable shelters that somehow stayed warmer than log cabins. One morning in late November, after watching her daughter cough through another frigid awakening, Sarah made a decision. She was going to build a house between her house and her barn. Not a real house, not even a shed. Something simpler, something that would stop the wind, trap a pocket of warmer air, and let her move between buildings without flash freezing her home. She called it a tunnel. Her neighbors would call it something else entirely. The first thing Sarah did was measure. 80 feet from cabin door to barn door. 7 feet wide would give her clearance to carry buckets and move without brushing the walls. 8 feet tall at the peak, so she wouldn't feel buried. She sketched it out on the back of a seed catalog. A simple A-frame corridor, canvas stretched over wooden ribs, anchored to both structures. The materials came from 3 sources. The frame. She had Jacob's lumber pile, rough pine planks he'd been saving for a storage addition that would never be built. She cut them into 10 arch supports, each 1/8 feet at the crown, staked into the frozen ground every 8 feet along the path. The covering, 2 heavy-duty canvas tarps she'd bought for wagon repairs, plus an old tent from her brother-in-law who'd given up on prospecting. Total coverage, nearly 700 square feet of tightly woven cotton duck canvas, the kind that freight companies use because it didn't rip easy. The ceiling, rope, leather straps, and a mix of pine tar and tallow to waterproof the seams. She lashed the canvas tight to the frames, overlapped the sections by a full foot, and used heat from rendered fat to seal every stitch line. It took her 11 days, working in the early afternoons when the sun gave a few degrees of mercy. The structure looked exactly like what it was: temporary, improvised, and assembled by someone who had no formal training in building. The canvas sagged slightly between supports. The color was mismatched: brown, gray, and a sun-faded tan that had once been white. The entrance flaps were tied with rawhide strips that flapped when the wind hit. But here's what it did. The tunnel created a thermal buffer zone. When Sarah opened her cabin door, she stepped into a space that wasn't warm, maybe 40 degrees Fahrenheit on a cold day, but it wasn't minus 10 degrees Fahrenheit either. The canvas blocked the wind entirely. No convective heat loss. No direct exposure. She walked the 80 feet, opened the barn door, tended the animals, and walked back. Total cabin door open time, maybe 40 seconds, versus the previous 5 minutes of repeated in and out. The air inside the tunnel held heat that radiated from both buildings. Not much, just the residual warmth bleeding through the cabin wall and the slight animal heat from the barn. But in that narrow corridor, with no wind to strip it away, it accumulated. On sunny days, the dark canvas absorbed solar radiation and pushed the tunnel temperature up to 50 degrees Fahrenheit by noon, even when the outside air was 15 below. It wasn't a heated space. It was a defrozen space. And from a pure physics standpoint, it was brilliant. But nobody saw it that way. The first person to comment was Roy Pittman, a bull hacker who hauled freight between Helena and the settlement. He stopped by in early December to deliver a shipment of flour and stood staring at the tunnel for a full minute before speaking. "Ma'am, are you living in a tent now?" Sarah explained the concept. Pittman nodded slowly, the way you nod at someone who's clearly losing their grip. "Uh-huh. Well, you stay warm now." By mid-December, the ridicule had spread. At the Sunday gathering, an informal meeting held in the Kohler barn because the settlement didn't have a church yet, Sarah overheard the conversations. Margaret Stein, whose husband ran a small saw operation, didn't even bother lowering her voice. "She's got a refugee camp connecting her house to her barn. It's embarrassing. I'd rather freeze than live like that." Otis Carver, a carpenter with 20 years of experience building homes from Wisconsin to Oregon, was more direct. He pulled Sarah aside after the meeting with what he clearly thought was helpful advice. "Mrs. Hartwell, I respect your situation, I do. But that canvas setup is going to get you killed. First big wind, it's coming down. If it catches fire from a spark, you're trapped between two structures with burning fabric collapsing on you. And the moisture, Lord, the moisture. You're going to get mold, rot, maybe worse. You need a real mudroom. Logs, a proper door. I can help you plan it come spring, but that tent has got to go." She thanked him and ignored him. The worst comment came from someone she'd considered a friend. Hannah Driscoll, another widow who'd remarried a local ranch hand, stopped by with her new husband in mid-December. While he checked Sarah's firewood supply, an awkward gesture of charity, Hannah walked the length of the tunnel, shaking her head. "Sarah, honey, this isn't what frontier women do. We endure. We don't build circus tents between our buildings." People are starting to talk. "It looks like you've given up." Sarah didn't argue. She just asked a simple question. "How much wood did you burn last week?" "I don't know. A cord, maybe more." "What?" "I burned half that. And my cabin's warmer." Hannah frowned. "Well, good for you, I suppose." But she didn't believe it. None of them did. That was fine. Sarah wasn't trying to convince anyone. She was trying to survive the winter. The storm arrived on January 14th, 1884. It came from the north, the way the killing storms always did, a gray wall of wind and snow that turned the sky the color of old iron. The temperature dropped 20 degrees in 4 hours. By nightfall, it was minus 18 degrees Fahrenheit with wind gusts hitting 40 miles per hour. And it didn't stop. For 6 days, the blizzard hammered the Montana grasslands. Snow piled 4 feet deep in the open country, 6 feet in the drifts. The wind was so vicious it tore shingles off roofs, collapsed a grain shed at the Merrick place, and killed 3 head of cattle that got separated from a barn. Most families hunkered down and waited it out. You kept the fire burning, you rationed food, and you didn't go outside unless you absolutely had to. But livestock don't stop needing care. just because the weather turns lethal. At the Stein homestead, Margaret's husband made the barn run twice a day, same as always. Each trip took 15 minutes in the brutal cold. Each time he came back inside, the cabin temperature plummeted. Margaret later told the story at a quilting circle. They burned through 2 full cords of wood in those 6 days just trying to keep the house livable. The children were wrapped in every blanket they owned. Ice formed on the inside of the windows. Roy Pittman, the freight driver, had been staying at the Kohler place when the storm hit. He helped with barn duty and later reported that Kohler's son came back from one evening check with frostbite on 3 fingers. They'd been outside less than 10 minutes. Otis Carver, the experienced carpenter, had a different problem. His barn was close, only 50 feet, but his dog got out during one trip and disappeared into the whiteout. Carver spent 20 minutes searching before giving up. The dog turned up dead 2 days later, frozen solid near the property line. The search had cost him. His cabin dropped to 48 degrees Fahrenheit and took 6 hours of hard burning to recover. At the Hartwell place, things went differently. Sarah made her barn runs on schedule. Twice a day, every day, just like always. She opened the cabin door, stepped into the tunnel, walked 80 feet through canvas-filtered darkness, tended the animals, and walked back. The tunnel flexed and snapped in the wind. The canvas roared like a sail fighting a gale. Snow packed against the north-facing side until the fabric sagged under the weight, but the structure held. Inside the tunnel, the temperature stayed between 28 degrees Fahrenheit and 35 degrees Fahrenheit, cold enough to see your breath, but 60 degrees warmer than the killing wind outside. Sarah's total door-open time per trip, 30 seconds. Her cabin never dropped below 61 degrees Fahrenheit during the entire storm. On the 6th day, when the wind finally died and the sun broke through, neighbors started venturing out to check on each other. That's when they saw the numbers. Stay with me, because what happened next humbled the entire settlement, and the measurements don't lie. When Otis Carver came by on the 7th day, he wasn't there to apologize. He was there to understand. He found Sarah splitting kindling outside the barn, her daughter Emma carrying the pieces to a covered stack near the cabin door. The tunnel entrance flapped gently in the calm morning air. Carver stood looking at it for a long moment before speaking. "Mrs. Hartwell, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be straight with me." Sarah set down the axe. "Go ahead. How much wood did you burn during the storm?" She'd been tracking it carefully, the way she tracked everything that winter. 3/4 of a cord, maybe a bit less. Carver's face went blank. 3/4. "Yes, sir. We burned 2.5, and our place was cold the whole time." He walked over to the tunnel entrance and pulled the canvas flap aside, peered into the dim corridor, stepped inside and stood there, absorbing the temperature difference. When he emerged, he had the expression of a man who just watched basic arithmetic prove him completely wrong. "It's 40 degrees in there." "About that," Sarah said. "Depends on the sun. And you're keeping the cabin at what? Between 60 and 65. Hasn't dropped below 60 once since I finished the tunnel." Carver walked the length of the structure, examining the frame, the canvas overlap, the way she'd sealed the connection points to both buildings. He crouched down and checked the snow accumulation, noted how the north side had drifted, but the supports had held. He ran his hand along a seam, feeling the tar and tallow waterproofing. When he came back, he asked the question that mattered. "How long does it take you to do barn duty now?" 15 minutes inside, maybe 30 seconds of actual door-open time. He did the math in his head, compared it to his own routine. 10 to 15 minutes outside, 5 minutes of total door exposure, cabin temperature dropping 15 to 20 degrees every single time. You're losing maybe 3 degrees per trip, 4 at most. Carver nodded slowly. Then he asked if she had any spare canvas. Within 3 days, the story had spread through the entire settlement. Not because Sarah told anyone, she didn't, but because people started comparing notes. Roy Pittman, the freight driver, had stayed at the Kohler place during the storm. He reported they burned through nearly 3 cords of wood, keeping a 2-room cabin livable. When he mentioned Sarah's consumption numbers, Kohler didn't believe him. So Pittman rode out to verify. He came back shaking his head. "She's got a tent between her buildings, and it's saving her 30% on wood. Maybe more. Margaret Stein heard the story from her husband, who'd heard it from Carver. She rode over on a clear afternoon in late January, ostensibly to check on Sarah and the children. What she really wanted to see was the tunnel. Sarah walked her through it, explained the physics in simple terms. The canvas stops the wind completely. That's the main thing. Convective heat loss is what kills you. Moving air, stripping warmth away. In here, the air is still. It's cold, but it's not stealing heat from my body or my cabin. Margaret touched the canvas wall, felt its thickness. And it doesn't freeze? The canvas? No. It gets stiff when it's real cold, but it doesn't freeze solid. And the frame flexes enough to handle wind without breaking. What about moisture? Otis said you'd have mold problems. Sarah pointed to the ventilation gaps she'd left at the peak of each section. Air moves through. Slow, but it moves. I haven't seen any condensation building up. And the canvas is treated. It sheds water. Margaret walked back to the cabin end, stood in the doorway, and looked back down the 80-foot corridor. The math was impossible to ignore. Less wood, warmer cabin, safer trips, less time exposed to killing cold. She asked the same question Carver had asked. You have extra canvas? By the end of February, 2 other families had built their own versions. The Hendersons, who ran a small dairy operation 3 miles south, built a 60-foot tunnel connecting their house to their milking barn. They used old wagon covers and scrap lumber. It wasn't as neat as Sarah's, but it worked. Their wood consumption dropped by a quarter. The Vasquez family, recent arrivals from New Mexico who were still adapting to northern winters, built a shorter version, just 40 feet to their chicken coop and tool shed. They added a wood pile inside the tunnel, which meant they could access dry fuel without ever going outside. Their children stopped getting sick every time the temperature dropped. Even Otis Carver, the man who'd warned Sarah about fire hazards and structural failure, built a modified design at his own place. He used a lower profile, 6 feet at the peak instead of 8, and added removable panels so he could take it down in summer. When someone asked him about it at the spring auction, he gave the closest thing to an apology Sarah ever received. Turns out I was wrong about the tent. It's not pretty, but it's practical. And practical beats pretty when it's 20 below. The numbers told the story that pride wouldn't. Sarah's tunnel, built for less than $8 in materials, saved her roughly 40% on heating costs through the worst part of winter. Her cabin maintained an average temperature 6 to 8 degrees higher than comparable homes. Her children were healthier. Her livestock were better tended. And she'd done it with what amounted to a well-organized camping setup. The tunnel wasn't perfect. It required maintenance, readying sections after heavy wind, clearing snow from the entrance flaps, checking the waterproofing. It wouldn't win any architectural awards. And yes, it looked strange. But in a winter that killed livestock, froze children's fingers, and burned through wood piles like they were kindling, Sarah Hartwell's canvas corridor did something that mattered more than aesthetics. It worked. And everyone who laughed at it had to eventually admit that the woman they'd pitted had understood something they'd missed. The best solution isn't always the most conventional one. Sometimes it's just the one that solves the problem. By the winter of 1885 to 86, canvas tunnels had become a common sight in the Montana settlements north of Helena. Not everywhere, not universally, but enough that when new families arrived and asked about winter preparations, someone would eventually mention the tunnel option. Usually with a qualifier, it looks rough, but it works, but the recommendation was there. Sarah's original design had been copied, modified, and adapted to fit different situations. Some families built permanent wooden versions with canvas roofs. Others kept the full tent design, but added double wall sections for extra insulation. A few enterprising homesteaders started building them in summer, using the tunnel as covered storage during warm months and converting it to a thermal buffer when temperatures dropped. The technique even acquired a local name, weather doors. Not because they were actual doors, but because they created a weatherproof transition zone between heated and unheated spaces. Sarah herself made one significant modification in the second year. She added a small wood stove at the midpoint of the tunnel. Nothing fancy, just a salvaged barrel stove vented through a tin pipe. On the coldest days, she'd light it for an hour in the morning and again in the evening. The tunnel temperature would climb to 55 degrees Fahrenheit or 60 degrees Fahrenheit, which meant she could do maintenance work, sharpening tools, mending harnesses, in relative comfort instead of inside the crowded cabin. By 1887, when a territorial survey team passed through the area documenting homestead innovations, they noted the prevalence of covered passage structures and interviewed several families about their effectiveness. The report, filed with the General Land Office, included temperature comparisons and wood consumption data. Sarah's name appeared twice, credited as the originating designer. She never sought credit, never promoted the idea, never tried to sell plans or claim any kind of expertise. But the technique spread because it solved a real problem with minimal resources, and that's how practical knowledge has always moved through communities. Not through marketing or mandates, but through quiet proof. The deeper principle, the one that Sarah understood instinctively, was older than canvas and older than homesteading. Humans have been creating thermal buffer zones for thousands of years. The Japanese jinkan, a sealed entryway that keeps outdoor cold from mixing with indoor warmth. The Mongolian gur, with its felt-layered walls and carefully designed airflow. The Norse turf houses with their thick earthen barriers. The Inuit karmak, a hybrid structure that combines stone, sod, and skin to create layered protection against Arctic cold. Every one of these solutions understood the same physics. Direct exposure to moving cold air is what kills heat retention. Stop the wind, create a transition zone, and you reduce thermal shock to your primary living space. Sarah didn't invent this principle. She just applied it with the materials she had and the skills she knew. And that's the real lesson of the tunnel. Frontier wisdom wasn't about having the perfect tools or the most advanced techniques. It was about recognizing what actually matters, in this case, stopping convective heat loss, and finding the simplest, cheapest, fastest way to achieve it. A few dollars of canvas, some scrap lumber, 11 days of work, and a willingness to ignore people who confuse conventional with correct. The settlers who mocked Sarah's tunnel weren't stupid or cruel. They were just doing what most people do when confronted with something unfamiliar, assuming that different means inferior. They'd built cabins the way cabins were supposed to be built. They'd endured winters the way winters were supposed to be endured. The idea that a woman with a sewing background could solve a heating problem that experienced carpenters had simply accepted as unsolvable. It didn't fit the pattern. But the measurements didn't care about patterns. 61 degrees versus 48 degrees. 3/4 of a cord versus 2.5 cords. 30 seconds of door exposure versus 5 minutes. Those numbers weren't opinions. They were evidence. And evidence, given enough time and enough witnesses, eventually overrides skepticism. Sarah Hartwell lived on that Montana homestead until 1904, when her children had grown, and she moved to Helena to live with her daughter Emma. The canvas tunnel stayed up, maintained by the family who bought the property, until sometime around 1911 when they finally built a permanent enclosed walkway. But by then, the principle had long since proven itself, not through drama or spectacle, but through 20 winters of consistent, unglamorous performance. Through families who stayed warmer, burned less wood, and kept their children healthier because someone had been willing to try something that looked foolish and turn out to be wise. That's the pattern you see again and again in frontier innovation. The solutions that endure aren't always the ones that look impressive. They're the ones that work when everything else is failing. The ones that can be built with limited resources, understood by people without formal training, and adapted to local conditions. Sarah's tunnel was never going to appear in architectural journals or win engineering awards. But on a January night in 1884, when the wind was screaming and the temperature was 18 below zero, it kept a widowed homesteader and her 2 children warm enough to sleep soundly. And in the end, that's the only measure that mattered. If this story resonated with you, I want to hear from you. Drop a comment below telling me where you're watching from and what's the coldest winter you've ever faced. Have you ever had to improvise a solution that everyone thought was crazy until it worked? Share your story. I read every comment. And if you want more of these real frontier techniques that actually kept people alive when conventional wisdom failed, make sure you're subscribed. Every week, I bring you the engineering, the history, and the practical lessons from people who didn't have the luxury of being wrong. See you in the next one. Educational note. This video presents historically inspired reconstructions for educational and storytelling purposes. Characters, names, and specific events are fictional, while the techniques, concepts, and principles discussed are based on real historical practices and well-established physical or practical knowledge. Any modern application should be evaluated according to current standards, safety guidelines, and applicable laws or regulations. This content is educational in nature and does not constitute professional, technical, or legal advice.